we currently have an amazing lineup of 5 speakers, which I will briefly introduce before they start to share their stories. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you all to our first speaker, who is Professor Jayadantas, who is the Dean International in the Faculty of Health Sciences and a professor in the School of Public Health at Curtin University in Western Australia. Dr. Dantas has worked for 34 years in India, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Timor-Leste, and Australia, and has undertaken consultancies in Pakistan, Kosovo, Sri Lanka, Singapore, and South Africa. Since year 2000, she has undertaken research projects in Rwanda, Australia, India, Timor-Leste, Sri Lanka, and Uganda, with a focus on refugee and migrant populations. Her teaching, research, and advocacy are based on human rights, resilience, social determinants, and health inequalities. Jaya, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Bram. I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides. And before I begin, I too would like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people from Western Australia on whose land I present and who have also allowed me to come from afar to live and work in their land. And I pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. So I shall share my screen. Are you able to see the screen? So for the next 5 to 8 minutes, I'm very quickly going to run through some of the global perspectives of LGBTIQ plus refugees as they seek asylum. So I wanted to just recap. In my first presentation, when we did the first presentation, the issue, what is the issue? 72 countries in the world as of 2020 still criminalize private consensual sexual activity between adults of the same sex. All of them criminalize men, and 44 of them criminalize women who have same-sex activity. 11 of these countries out of the 72 impose the death penalty for same-sex intimacy. So for many people in these countries, having a same-sex relationship is actually quite difficult, and you can be criminalized, you can be put into prison, you can be ostracized, and all of these issues make it quite difficult for people to live in their countries of birth. And that is why they seek to leave those countries, because they want to come out, they want to live openly. There are distinct vulnerabilities of LGBTIQ plus refugees. They experience persecution and discrimination in distinct ways. So you have lesbian, gay, bisexual, intersex, and transgender people. And coming from India, we had a very visible transgender population. But for the other groups, it was only recently that the government in India supported same-sex marriage, as well as equality, as well as rights in many ways. But here I have 2 images that I've put forward, where you have the top image in Germany, where they are protesting for refugee rights. And the one at the bottom is from Kenya, outside the UNHCR offices, where again, there's a protest for refugee rights. In this picture at the bottom, there are refugees from different countries. There are refugees from other African countries in Uganda or South Sudan or Sudan who actually seek asylum. According to international human rights law, according to Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And Article 2 declares that everyone is entitled to all rights and freedoms that are set forth in this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That was actually, that was ratified by most countries in the world immediately after the Second World War in 1948. Now, according to this, all individuals, including LGBTIQ+, are entitled to enjoy protection provided for by international human rights on the basis of equality and non-discrimination. But we know that doesn't happen. And in the image on the left-hand side, what you can see is 4 Syrian youth. They have sought asylum in Germany, and they were in a refugee camp, in a crowded refugee camp in Dresden in Germany, and they decided to come out and say that they were gay. And immediately the persecution started. So here it's in flight. They have left their country of birth, they have sought asylum, there was protracted civil conflict, and there has been and is ongoing civil conflict in Syria, and here they are in Germany. But because of the persecution that they faced within the refugee camp or within the transit camp in Germany, they were actually provided with other secure accommodation by rights groups, especially LGBTIQ rights groups in Germany. In addition to severe discrimination and violence, they can have they can have exclusion to basic services, detention, and basically in cases where there's displacement and where there's forced displacement and seeking of asylum, this harm is continued, and this is a reality for them. With the asylum process, the mistreatment continues even when they're in detention. And there's been reports of cases across the world, more so in some countries more than others. So there has been reports in the Kenyan refugee camps. So although Kenya criminalizes it, it actually doesn't implement by any sort of, it's not enforced in many ways, but they find it really difficult. Now, we saw that in Germany. There has been instances in the offshore detention centers in Australia also, where while seeking asylum, they feel very vulnerable. So there are numerous examples where they can be abused, both physically and sexually, and verbally. Then when they are being questioned by the tribunal or by their courts about their asylum status, then the credibility of non-heterosexual asylum applicants becomes much more difficult. One of the things that we have to lobby and advocate for is to decriminalize consensual same-sex sexual activity, uphold the freedom of association rights for LGBTIQ plus people in the countries where they are seeking asylum, and ensure that there are constitutional protection in the countries, and there's no discrimination based on sexual orientation and or gender identity, and often challenge the degrading treatment of LGBTIQ plus people, even where there's forced medical examinations. And the thing that happens during the asylum process is, in a short period of time during the interview, they have to prove that they are in same-sex relationships. They have to prove, and often they have to use an interpreter from their same culture. And this, in certain cases, has proved to be problematic, because, and often with some interview process, they'd say, oh, but not all areas of Pakistan are problematic. You can go and live in some other area, but that's not the issue. The issue is this is not accepted in the country. And in the image here is 2 young African women, one from Kenya and one from Nigeria, who have sought asylum in Germany and have found the process quite difficult. So the in-transit process of seeking asylum has been quite difficult. So UNHCR staff globally feel that there's a number of factors. There's not one single mitigating factor, but there'll be legal factors, social factors, cultural factors, and the ability to exercise fundamental freedoms, like, do gay people come out openly when they are seeking asylum, or they are worried because they are still in detention? There are others from their country there who are in heterosexual relationships who may not accept this. And this is a constant dilemma that they are faced with. And an investigation into a person's sexual orientation is often embarrassing. It can be invasive, and sexual orientation is a subjective matter, and it's not easily reconciled with objective proof that is required. And that is why it's important to protect the rights of LGBTI plus Q refugees when they are in transit. And many countries have sought to do so. So Norway has said that they'll fast track applications from people who are much more vulnerable, and especially LGBTIQ. Certain guidelines in the UK have begun. We also have guidelines in many countries of the EU. And we European Union found that often an applicant's right to privacy and human dignity can be violated when there are questions about sexual practices. And when they initially did not identify as LGBTIQ plus in the first instance because of fear, of some sort of discrimination and persecution till they've actually reached the in-transit country. And yet these elements still appear in even Australian decisions. And sometimes perhaps it's due to lack of training of decision makers or immigration officials and the limited guidance on sexual orientation, gender identity, or intersex-based claims. The images here are from Norway. Norway has come out quite as one of those countries that processes claims much more quickly. The difficulties are in countries like Turkey, which are in between transit country for asylum seekers, both from LGBTIQ communities and both actually escaping forced migration. And that is why in offshore detention services, one has to meet the particular needs of LGBTIQ plus asylum seekers and refugees. But we still have, in the broader context of border policies, which are being tightened globally, and COVID-19 has added another dimension to it, that are human rights violations. So as we continue our talk, I think I've just wanted to give you an overview that it is a very complex process. It's not a simple process. And every country has its own rules and rights that it puts in place. But it's providing the evidence, and this both objective and subjective evidence that proves quite harrowing to refugees from LGBTIQ plus backgrounds. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jaya, for giving us the international backdrop of the situation, which is very important for us to move on to the next sections of this webinar. So the second, I'm going to move on to, if you have any question, could you please type it in the Q&A box, and then we're going to discuss it at the end of all the presentations. Thank you. So next, we will have Tina Dixon, who is a feminist academic and a policy professional who has worked in the areas of LGBTIQA refugee and women's rights, both in Australia and in overseas. Tina has a strong experience engaging with international human rights bodies, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Tina has also been involved in the development of the Global Compact on Refugees in the United Nations Refugee Agency, focusing on inclusion and mainstreaming of age, gender, and diversity-sensitive approaches. Tina is a PhD candidate at the Australian National University, researching lived experiences of LGBTIQ asylum-seeking and refugee women in Australia. Tina sought asylum in Australia as a queer human rights defender in 2012 with her wife. Tina, the time is yours.
Thank you, Bram, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm going to also share my slides. Of course, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are all meeting on a traditional lens. I'm joining from the lens of Ngunnawal and Ngambri people down in the ACT, and I pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. And I also would like to acknowledge brother boys and sister girls whose experiences have been here for centuries and centuries. And I also would like to acknowledge the lives of those LGBTIQ+ people who have never made it to safety, and those who are still stuck in those unsafe conditions. we always work towards the safety for every single person who is an LGBTIQ+ person. A little bit about me. So as Bram said in my bio, I've been living in Australia for 8 years, and we came here together with my wife Renee. Feels like ages ago. Came pretty much into uncertainty, not knowing what's going to happen next, with 2 suitcases, no hopes for the future, no home anymore. And I think back where we come from, we were the human rights activists, and at some point in our life, we were facing the choice between life, death, or loss. And I think, coming to Australia was sort of the choice between life, but also loss. The picture here in the between with all the rainbow flags, it's from the Queer Displacement Conference last year. Many of you would know or attended the event. It was the first conference in Australia specifically focusing on LGBTQ plus displacement. And we brought a lot of people to discuss these issues, and as an outcome of that conference, we developed the Canberra Statement, which was the first in the world statement for the global solidarity with LGBTQ plus people seeking asylum and refugees. So currently, following on that all work, during this time in Australia, this year we've established the first national organization to specifically work on the issues of LGBTQ plus displacement, called Possibly Displaced People Network. We are an LGBTQ plus refugee-led organization, and our main purpose is to provide this place of community, belonging, and safety for LGBTQ plus possibly displaced people. If you go on our website, you can find out more what we do, but essentially we are working towards a world where people feel safe, included, and we'll also do so by working with different organizations, and we offer various training and support for organizations who want to make sure that their services are inclusive, and both in terms of cultural competency, migration status, but also for sexual and gender diversity as well. So Dr. Dantas mentioned this and showed you the slide in terms of, the rights when it comes to same-sex couples. I think sometimes what also gets slightly omitted is the situation for trans people in particular. And I think this map is not developed as the map by ILGA, and countries in grey simply means that there is no information or data collected. But we still have so many countries in the world where people are persecuted for being trans, and those countries where they're not, for them to transition, quite often a lot of restrictions are in place, both in terms of, for example, not having partner, not having underage children, the necessity to go through the medical transition, and a lot of other restrictive conditions. And I think in my presentation, I sort of want to elaborate a little bit on the international context, but trying to disaggregate between those different identities that people have, and look in sort of more broadly also on women, because this is my particular area of expertise and research. Quite often we're not hearing enough about experiences of lesbian, bisexual, and queer women, even though there are specific countries that persecute them. But I think in the context of really patriarchal societies, women get to be really silenced, and women do, every member of LGBTQ plus community is subjected to quite high rates of sexual and gender-based violence. But what we're often seeing for women, a lot of them are forced into marriages, and we still have currently about 30 countries in the world where a woman cannot apply for passport or travel documents without the permission from the male guardian, whether that be a husband or a father. And so we're seeing significantly smaller amount of women being able to even seek asylum and to cross borders and come to the countries. In terms of the sexual and gender-based violence, and I should have sort of made a content warning, I think for LGBTQ plus people, the violence has become such an integral, in a way, part of your life that sometimes we talk about it in a slightly detached way, but I acknowledge that for people, knowing this information can be a little bit too much. But women in particular are quite often forced into marriages, FGM, female genital mutilations perpetrated on them. And in particular, in my research, what I've seen is where women are caught or assumed to be having relationship with other women, their sexuality is not treated as sexuality, treated as simply sex desire. And then within the patriarchal context, they're told, well, if you want to have sex, you have to be married, and the only appropriate way is obviously with a man. And so also sometimes we've had cases where FGM was performed as a way to sort of control their desire and control women's sexuality. And then in the context, obviously, of forced marriage, we see quite high rates of forced pregnancy. And then when we're thinking about the determination of LGBTQ protection claims, quite a lot of lesbian, bisexual, queer women will actually have children, and quite often decision makers cannot comprehend how can a queer woman have a child, and it's almost used against them that they're not queer enough. In terms of the camp settings as well, quite high level of survival sex, sexual harassment and violence, and in particular from staff as well in those camps, humanitarian staff, unfortunately. I wanted to share some of these stories here and their de-identified and their sort of draw on our cumulative impact as well, because I think it is really important that we are talking about those contexts and legislative protections or discriminations that are inflicted by the laws, but it's also really important to take into account those patriarchal settings, familial and societal pressures, because sometimes even when we don't have legislation, those pressures are so high, that stigma and lack of opportunities are so high that it is worse than having a law to criminalize. And this is the photograph of Ashanti, and the name is changed, who is a queer woman, and at some point in her life she was forced into a marriage. And sort of, she had no choice but to get married. And her husband then turned out to be really physically abusive against her. And after some time in the marriage, she decided that she couldn't do it anymore and that she would seek divorce. And so she came back to her country to seek divorce under the Islamic law. And her family does not know that she is queer. However, for her family, even that act of seeking divorce under Islamic law was so much shame that they completely disowned her, and they moved out to a different place. And so she had to go on her own through that kind of experience. And even though she does come from a country that persecutes explicitly LGBTQ+ people, because she was never really out, she wasn't subjected to that experience. But the whole pressure from family and society was really enough for her to completely be unsafe and to be alone. And I think a lot of people go through these experiences without having anyone with them. When we're talking about bisexual people, I think this group is completely invisible. And, we have both biphobia within the LGBTQ+ communities and also outside. This is the research from camp in Kenya that said that 57% of bisexual men reported having experienced sexual violence at least on one occasion in their stories. And I think most importantly, those bi people who are seeking safety, decision makers are completely not trained to be able to understand that this is not about choice or choosing the correct partner, that this is the same inherent sexuality for this cohort in particular. Gay men also, they statistically represent a much larger group, and the 70% comes from also the statistics in Kenya. But again, with those patriarchal contexts, where men either openly gay, perceived as gay, they're also subjected to quite a high rate of sexual and gender-based violence, and also are forced to engage in survival sex and sex work. Trans people have quite different experiences, and I think one of the also distinctions for them is the access to documents and the gender reaffirming healthcare, and the possibility to transition, but also to live life openly as who you are in your countries of origin. Those who do not have documents, they would have limited opportunities for livelihoods, where their gender identity and their appearance doesn't match, or their name doesn't match those ones identified in the documents. And the last group that I wanted to quickly touch on is intersex people, where completely we don't hear really much enough. I want to urge you to sign on to the Darlington Statement, which was produced by the Intersex Human Rights Australia, that does detail a lot about the human rights of intersex people in general. FDPN is a proud signatory to that. And we still see, both including in Australia actually, that intersex people experience forced medical interventions where medical professions think that there is something not normal with their bodies and they want to feed them into this rigid understanding of female and male, even though there is a greater diversity that exists. There's no appropriate healthcare. When children are born intersex in particular countries, family members will also experience stigma, and in some countries, being intersex is sort of associated with witchcraft, and those people are refused to receive birth certificates and registrations, which down the track will obviously be a huge problem for people not having documents and not being able to travel. At FDPN, we work with a lot of people, and later I'll send in the chat the link to the cartoon that we produced last year from the Queer Sisterhood Project, where we worked with a group of 10 women seeking asylum in here who are queer. And he was saying they're sharing those experiences in their countries of origin, as they were sort of seeking asylum. So somebody was saying, I was pleasing the society, lying to them, and at the same time not being honest to myself as a queer woman. And I think, thinking from the mental health perspective, the burden that is there on people constantly having to hide, not being able to be who they are, on top of those complex experiences of discrimination, of trauma, of actual violence. So people are coming to Australia with quite complex experiences of trauma, and we can't be comparing to other groups of refugees, but I think the experiences here are so much more distinct, because quite often that victimization begins from the onset, from the very beginning, where a person, they may not even come out yet, but they are perceived for being queer, and so they're subjected to those experiences, and the cumulative effects are always there. And so, for example, one woman was saying, I had to hide my real gender identity, being unable to transition as a trans woman in their country. And just, those kind of experiences are really difficult for people to navigate. And so when sort of to sum up this bit part, what drives people to seek safety, we've got the homo, biphobic, transphobic persecution, we've got the impact of patriarchy on this group, societal familial pressure, which are also combined with those other drivers of displacement, such as war, climate change, and that types of violence is obviously ongoing. And most importantly, it's really inflicted on people by multiple perpetrators. It's not only states, it's not only the law, quite often it's family, your community. So really, you end up being all on your own with nobody to rely on. It's also important to talk about the refugee camps. At the moment, a lot of, situation happens in Kakuma refugee camp in the block 113. Initially, LGBTQ plus people there were allocated a particular section of the camp just for LGBTQ plus people, and that made them really known and allowed them to the broader group of refugees, and they're experiencing ongoing violence and abuse, and quite horrific violence. While some agencies are aware who working, not much has been done up to the date, to the point. And I think, this is really important, that people in refugee camps are protected, but also we have to come up with the ways that we're not singling them out and making them a target for other communities, but we're able to both collect the information and really move them to safety quickly. Of course, only less than 1% of people globally will be resettled. However, some groups are at such high risk of violence that we really have to make sure that those groups are resettled as a priority. Detention centers also, as was mentioned before, really unsafe space. And this is a photograph of one of the women who we work with, who currently, went on and lives a really great life, and, finishing her degree at the university, for whom we're really proud. But when she came to Australia, she was placed in a detention center straight away because she didn't have a visa to enter Australia. There was no sign in detention that there were any workers who were expert or who were trained during the sort of communal spaces for mixed genders, and so she's a survivor of violence, and for her to be in those spaces was a really traumatizing and unsafe experience. And she was there for 3 months, not knowing what's going to happen to her. And the only way she was able to get out of detention was pretty much, by luck and chance that some of her ethnic communities were visiting and looking for people from their country in the detention and trying to link them with appropriate services and legal support. But for LGBTQ plus people, detention becomes another place which is absolutely unsafe. There's nothing that can be done, and they become subjected to further violence. But then when we're thinking about these experiences of the early arrival as well, I think, people come here to Australia with, those really complex traumatic experiences of displacement. In Australian context, we've got the huge delays in the immigration system that obviously impact you hugely because, you're stuck in this limbo, not knowing what's going to happen. And for those people who are on temporary protection visas, the whole need to reapply every 3 to 5 years is also the inability to move on with their life. But also when they come here, I think the sense of isolation is really huge. And the isolation comes from the invisibility. I really commend you for doing this webinar today because we really do not have enough organizations in Australia speaking up. And, if you look at, for example, Refugee Week, it'll be really a handful, if not less, of refugee organizations, but also LGBTQ plus organizations who will acknowledge that, yes, it is a Refugee Week today. And yes, there are LGBTQ plus people who are targeted for simply who they love, nothing else, right? They're targeted simply for who they love and who they are. And because we're not seeing people represented, people see themselves that no one else like them exists. And so many people who come to forcibly displaced people network, the main thing that they want is to be seen, to know that their life matters, to know that their voice matters, to know that they're not alone and there are others like them. And I think, we also see that on the level, and I'm conscious of time, on the level of narratives, because quite often, a lot of organizations that do not work with LGBTQ refugees, they will be talking about refugees as fleeing war, as if that's the only definition. And of course, there are people fleeing war conflict, but we have to be acknowledging their great diversity, but not seeing yourself over and over and over again. So you come from the context where everybody was saying, well, your life is not legitimate. You have to do it. You have to live like this. This is something wrong with you. You come to Australia, presumably a safe place, and then you're still not seeing yourself, and the impact it has on people is huge. And I think we have to be working towards acknowledging that people are diverse. And sometimes, when the Home Affairs actually affirms the decision and grants the visa, it almost serves so that powerful affirmation and validation that yes, you see me, you exist, and you deserve to be safe and protected. So I think it's a challenge for everybody to really look at what we're doing and to make sure that you are acknowledging this great diversity in your work. So I'm going to stop on here. Please get in touch with us, follow us on socials, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina, for your presentation. This is just amazing. It's just just outlining all the complications and the complexities around this topic. Okay, so moving on, the next speakers are a team. So 3 speakers will speak as a team. First, we have Bijan Karduni, who was born in Iran on the 20th of April, 1984. He earned his bachelor's degree in English language and literature and his master's degree in British studies in Iran. He is a current PhD student at Western Sydney University. He started his studies in October 2017 in social sciences, specifically on homophobia in Iranian society. After the establishment of the Islamic Revolution in 1979 in Iran, the execution of gay men has become one of the practices by the regime in order to establish Sharia law in the society. Bijan, as an Iranian gay man, has first-hand experiences of daily life in general and gay life in Iran from the day he was born to the day he came to Australia. The cruelty and discrimination towards homosexuals in Iran were the main reasons for him to become a refugee in Australia. Bijan considers himself a gay man who has always tried to build a better place for himself and for the community. The next team member is Heather Grace Jones, who has been working in the community and international development for the past 2 decades. She has worked in Australia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Indonesia, and has experience in supporting civil society with a focus on gender mainstreaming, media development, training and education, and raising awareness across a range of issues, including the elimination of violence against women. Grace has worked at the Service for the Treatment and Rehabilitation of Torture and Trauma Survivors, or STARTS, for 4 years, initially as part of the Families in Cultural Transition team. She currently works alongside people from refugee backgrounds with diverse genders and sexualities, and is among the first LGBTIQIA+ project workers in a torture and trauma service worldwide. Grace is the co-editor of 2 books. The third team member is Prince, who has lived in Australia since 2019 and traveled here via the Emirates. He works in aged care and is interested in pursuing a career in community services. Prince has been part of the LGBTIQA+ support group for people with refugee and asylum seeker backgrounds for over 2 years, and currently works as a facilitator for a new peer-led group in Western Sydney. He misses his home, but has made a new life, which is sometimes challenging and sometimes joyful. Please note that for confidentiality purposes, Prince will not be using his video camera today. I'll let the team to speak together as a team. Perhaps Bijan, if you could start, and then Heather, Grace, and Prince could jump in. We have 20 minutes for your team presentation. Time is yours.
Hi, Bram. It's very lovely to see everyone and to be a part of this amazing webinar. I start with sending my regards and best wishes for all of the refugees and LGBTIQ refugees in particular, because as I said before, we are minority within a minority within a minority, and you can tenfold it. As the topic is the transition part, when I came to Australia, because I came here as a student, and I was thinking that, okay, maybe I can just follow my studies, and maybe I shouldn't go through that path because of the discrimination that I could see. But something happened to one of my friends, actually. He was studying in the UK, just like me, in the same situation. And he was invited to a wedding party of one of his close relatives in Iran. And for a holiday, he just went back to Iran to attend the wedding party. And during that time, he was invited to a gay party. And this is the last thing that we, till this now, know, because we know that the party was raided by the police, and we tried to contact the family, we tried everything, but we couldn't get any information. And till this day, we don't know what happened to him. When that thing happened, and it was like 7 months after I came to Australia, I needed to make a very big decision. And I can say that that decision for me was the transition, because I needed to think about not seeing my family again, not seeing my country again, not seeing my loved ones again, and to become someone in a very, very new situation. And that's a worst time for me, and I cannot imagine how a refugee might feel when they are in that transition, when they want to leave their home country and they want to go to another country as the destination, and then they are stuck in just in between in another country that is even maybe more dangerous than their home country. And I just can't imagine that. But I can imagine the thought process, the whole uh, notion of grief. And this is very hard to explain to a person that doesn't and hasn't experienced it. It's a notion that you need to think, okay, I'm going to lose so many precious things to get something precious. But even your goal as a precious thing to be free and to live your life doesn't really undermine the fact that you had to leave all of those precious things in your life. And I think that moment for any refugee was one of the biggest one. And it's like a scar. I call it a scar that it will not heal. This scar will always be with us. And I know that it's very sad, and it is very sad, but also it can give us resilience. And another thing that I want to mention, one of my very close friends, he has, and I talked to Tina about that before, and me and Tina and my friend, we are going to publish something about this story, about all of those LGBTI refugees that they are stuck in Turkey as the transition country, and they have lost their hope. They have been there 5 years, we have like 6 years, and you don't have any kind of um, law or organization to support you that much, because the UN in Turkey, the UN gave all the authorities to the Turkish border ministry, immigration and border ministry, and the way that they treated, especially LGBTIQ, because let's not forget that it's a very conservative country, I can say, and with a high level of homophobia and transphobia and also xenophobia. So those refugees who are stuck there, they need to deal with all of these things, and they don't have any rights. They cannot work. So they need to do black market and illegal work, and so they don't get paid. And the situation is really bad. To find housing and everything in Turkey as a transitioning country is very tough. I can say that 3 of my very close friends, they are stuck in Turkey now, and they are just waiting for the whole process for many years. And one of them, he had to go to Greece by boat. Such a dangerous thing to do, because uh, he was stuck in Turkey for 6 years. So I'm talking to my friends all the time, and they share their really hard situations. But I can just go back to what I said before. The whole transitioning thing, it's very hard and very sad, and we need to help them. at the same time, I'm so happy to see that they still have that resilience. And I really honor that. It's a very big thing. And me, myself, I really want to do anything that I can do, even if it's just publication or anything that we can just let the world know about their situations. They are forgotten there, and they are in a very, very bad situation. And even LGBTIQ refugees in Australia, they are in a kind of the same situation. I can say that, when you apply for a protection visa or asylum seekers, when you are in bridging visa, I think the name bridging visa is synonymous with in transit, because you don't have many rights as a permanent resident here. So you need to see how you can manage yourself, especially during the pandemic, when permanent resident and citizens here, they could get job seekers and job keeper. Those refugees in bridging visa situation, they couldn't get any financial help from the government. And that was really sad. And, they lost their jobs. They didn't have any other source. And that was really hard to see. And I'm very cautious of the time. So the last thing that I want to say is that, yes, we have the scar, and we should always remember from where we have come from. I mean, from the emotional and mental side, but also we are resilient, and together we can help all the LGBTIQ refugees.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, my very good friend, Prince.
Thanks, Bijan. Prince, would you like to continue next?
Yes. You can go ahead, Grace, if you want to say something.
I can be very quick, okay? I think people are much more interested in hearing from you two. I would also like just to say that I'm coming here from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and that sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land and water. And just to say that the thing that I've learned working alongside people with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, expressions and sex characteristics is that there's a huge range of stories and a huge range of experiences, and that people make the journey. They make it as students, on boats, over land, as visitors, with visas, in secret, in the dark of night, under threat of disappearance, with the help of family members who put themselves at risk. Alone, they come here in all sorts of ways and through all sorts of journeys. And as you have heard, people end up in flight in the midst of this transition in all sorts of different places. So we've heard from Tina about people ending up in refugee camps, and you in somewhere like Cox's Bazar, where there's no formal recognition of the specific needs of this cohort. There's a great deal of danger. The bathrooms there are particularly dangerous. There's very high rates of rape and assault there, and people talk about them as having bad ghosts. And all these rates are heightened, for example, for trans women, for trans men who are forced into using either women-specific facilities or male facilities where they're at risk of being outed, or being attacked, or being raped, or being harassed. As Bijan has beautifully talked about, some people leave one country where homosexuality is illegal, or perhaps there's even the death penalty, and they end up living or stuck in another country where homosexuality is at best taboo or at worst illegal. There's roughly 14,000 people seeking asylum stuck, for example, in Indonesia right now. And Indonesia has become increasingly transphobic, increasingly homophobic, increasingly a space where it's dangerous, simply dangerous to be, as Tina beautifully said, to be a person who loves another person or a person who wants to live the way that they need to live within their own identity. What we also see is that often in transit, in the flight experience, people find themselves at risk, not only from the communities or the countries they land up in, but also sometimes from other asylum seekers. So they face all sorts of challenges. They face challenges around employment, around housing, around access to appropriate healthcare, on top of which they are constantly invisibilized. I'm not actually sure if invisibilized is a word, but it's really worth saying that this level of invisibility is immense. There is literally no mention in the SDGs of the specific needs of this group. So UNHCR has some reasonable policies around this stuff, but most INGOs don't even see the needs of this group, much less cater for them. And it's worth pointing out, just very, very briefly, that this invisibility extends to disaster reduction relief. So people are often internally displaced as well as forcibly displaced or externally displaced because of a disaster, and they are turned away from shelters. They are unable to get access. Families are broken up. Gay couples aren't allowed to be together because they're not recognised as couples. This is standard practice all across the globe. So when people are moving from one place to another, they are in constant danger and excluded and invisibilized. And this is the everyday lived experience of the journeys of people who are LGBTQIA plus journeys that are dangerous and difficult and often with limited hope of a happy ending. And in all this diversity of experience, we have some common themes, and I think we've heard them tonight already twice. And so I just want to say what I see in the incredibly fortunate work that I'm able to do alongside people are the issues of safety, the issue of access to basic protection, and the issue of belonging. And this is not just some sort of airy-fairy notion about belonging. Connection is a human necessity, and finding it through the perilous journey from home country to country of resettlement, and much less when you end up here and, you know, trying to find a place for yourself is absolutely an enormous and difficult and extraordinarily complex process. And so what we see is that people with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, expressions, and sex characteristics are often isolated, unprotected, and vulnerable in that they have limited access to resources and they're alone. And this leads to death, illness, grief, loss, and of course, as Bijan has told us, strength and resourcefulness. So I guess where I will leave us is that we need policies, we need practices, we need resources, we need training, and we need to listen to voices. So Prince, can we listen to yours now?
Thank you, Grace. As I go by Prince, and as you know, yeah, I've chosen not to be anonymous because of the discrimination, stigma, and prejudice that we follow if I'm not anonymous from my own community, work, and even people who are well-meaning but not thinking about the damage they could cause me. Well, I was born in Africa and raised in Africa. That was from my mom's side, and my dad's side is from Emirates. And well, starting from Africa, like there's so much homophobic, which when I was a kid I couldn't understand because they talk so many languages and stuff, and sometimes they would insult us and say pede, which is a French word. So we would take it as an insult, but we don't realize their meaning in its meaning gay, but in a bad word. And you would just grow up, you know, with that homophobic, and yet I didn't know what was it until one of my classmates he was like having the feminist behavior. You see, like there's every kind of type of people, and he was not really accepted by his family and with people around the class and stuff. So they would every time, like insult him, and every time till one day he hang himself because of the family. They also were telling him they are really, they're so disappointing how he came in word, both parent and stuff. So yeah, out of nowhere, one day at school, they told us like he hang himself, like he commit suicide because of the way, like every day he would go back home crying, and maybe even at home he was not welcomed and stuff. So, which I had also, for me, seeing what he's passing through, I had to hide myself. Then after I want to live with my dad's family in Emirates, and yeah, it's a Muslim country, and as I know, I wasn't so really like knowing about LGBTQ word and stuff, so which I had to go pass through those apps like Grindr or whatever, or using maybe sometimes Instagrams and stuff. And I had met like two gay guy, which was so discreet, and yeah, they they were really good friends, and we had they really told me their experience of living in Emirates and stuff, which I lived too. Shortly, one of those two friends, he came out to his family, and their parent was like, "Oh, this is not you. It's kind of some devil you have in you, like, and stuff." And they had to take him to those called like share to pray for him. And you know then the guy one day come crying. He told us the story, and he told us that when his parents took him to the share, like he went there like for three times or four times. And one day the chair, he lied to him. He was like, "Oh, can you lie down? I'm gonna pray for you." And the chair started fingering him, and they're like, and like he couldn't say anything, and he cannot even tell the parents, because the parent, they're like, "Oh, the chair, he's a holy person, are you crazy or this?" So the friend had to live with that, which after a while we didn't know what happened to him, because we lost contact with him and stuff. And yeah, and even as we could understand, like it was so horrible and so painful, because I wouldn't say like the Middle Eastern or Muslims, words, they should realize like there's other people, like even they can be gay and stuff, but they don't realize there's those kind of things, which some people who get coming out, they don't know like what is passing through and stuff, and they take to them, which sometimes some of them, they are gay, and they ended up raping the kids or whatever without knowing. And which is so surprisingly, even you go on Grindr, you still find them like married people, and like really strange, and still like they're so against of it, and you're like, where to go? It's so unsafe, like you cannot tell this person or this person how you feel and what is going on. And yeah, then here comes my story, when also my family find out, when they just realize they Grindr up on my phone out of nowhere. So yeah, so which I had to leave the country following the experience I had with my friends and stuff. So, and on those time, the friend that took to the share, he was so lucky. Otherwise, other families, they can, they can just kill the kids or whatever and say because it's a shame of the family. And for me, it was so horrible because I was just coming into the family, trying to live in and stuff. So, and all of a sudden they just found like I'm gay and I had to leave. And so I passed like through days living in a place, just searching for a way to move out of the country. Like there is no family. I don't know anybody in Nemarat. Like it's just completely like the family of my dad, and I don't know. There's nobody else I do know. Even the other LGBTQ friends, I lost contact with them. I don't know what happened to them. And yeah, and I had an idea to come over in Australia, and I had to pass days and nights walking in somewhere like in the desert without no family. I don't know what's happening, and maybe also being searched and stuff, which I got lucky, and I got the visa to come here in Australia. And when I went to book for a ticket first, I heard that my passport was blocked by the family, and which I had to go and see someone in the court and say, see, I just booked a flight to go in Australia. I have to go study, and I don't know what's happening with my family. They just blocked me. So think about it. If it was your kid, would you accept this? If they're getting opportunity, like I just tried to get around because I didn't know if the family told them, oh, he's gay, he doesn't supposed to get out of the country or whatever. And thanks God that the teacher was a woman and she could understand. I really begged her, and like they gave me back the passport and gave an order like to just let me go. And on the same day, I just take the flight coming to Australia, and it had like 16 hours flight. Which was most horrible thing because I had to leave the family like I was already getting used to, and I was so near of it and of them, like and all of a sudden, due to my sexuality or whatever, my gender and stuff, everything just went so horrible. Like I could then recognize them. Like took me like to court, like to just not to let me go out of the country and stuff. I was like, wow. I was like, things can change, like when family becomes strangers out of nowhere and you don't have anybody, any, people like you can cry on and stuff. And yeah, then I flew here in Australia, which I arrived in Brisbane, and it was in the night. It was a horrible, I was like, like all the emotion of a week what just happened, like struggling with the court and struggling to get the money to come here. And, like no help, no one to talk. And plus I'm just coming in a country, I don't know anybody, I don't know anything. And yeah, all of a sudden on the airport, the police just stopped me, like they're like, oh, you're from Emirates. They had to search everything in my bag. They brought like dogs and stuff, and that's where it came. So it's like, oh, yeah, someone from Arab background. So they think, oh, he might be a terrorist or whatever. Like a young man coming in a country by himself and stuff. So it was first I was struggling with that, and like I want to explode and tell them, sorry, I just running from my home, and like because of I'm gay and stuff, like I see them, I want to tell them that, but still they're suspecting something else. And I'm like, what how did I come here? Like I could see them, like searching for my stuff, taking my laptop outside, my phones, everything. To even a paper, they had to check it. I was like, what's wrong with a paper? I also, like, from the first time, I couldn't feel like safe, like what's happening. Then, yeah. After a few days, I had to search any help in Australia, which I found the Asylum Center in Sydney, and I came to Sydney, and yeah, I had nothing. Like, that's life. I didn't know anything about LGBT background or whatever, or how it works in Australia and this. And as you know, like, there's some center, they still provide, like, they can provide housing and stuff, which on that day they put me with a Nigerian person, which became even more worse. And like, he started talking in Arabic, and like, wakes every bad memory from back home. At the time I felt hopeless, and I didn't know, like, what's the help, like, where am I gonna, like, wanna scream. I'm like, I'm just run away from the family, and I just came here, and still same situation, and yeah, it's really hard, like, to be understood. And sometimes, like, you really feel like you wanna go, like, you really wanna go back home, but you can't. And here comes, like, mental health, like, struggling with mental health, and trying to see how you can stay in Australia. And first they put you in bridging visa, and first you cannot get any job and stuff, and you spend more of days at home, so like, struggling with people and stuff. And yeah, it's really, as Bijan said, with bridging visa, it's really hard to get mental health, like, access and stuff. And I think we really need people to hear us, and especially, like, the government or whoever can help, LGBTQ people. And yeah, like, we need some voice, they hear us, how we've been through. This is like a kind of short story, because it's how everything, but there's more story in it. And yeah, we're going in shortcut story. But I'm really happy I got this opportunity to share at least this few moments. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bijan, Grace, and Prince, for sharing your stories. It's just amazing. Look, we're very quickly running out of time. Grace, just there's a question for you in the question and answer box. If you could perhaps type in your answer there, so that we can accommodate the question. I just have a question for all of you. Starting from all these the maps, that Jaya and Tina showed at the beginning, and now knowing this in transit experiences and the in transition countries problems and everything, how much of this do most refugees know prior to applying for asylum? And is there any way that we can help those who are still seeking asylum to know more about this issue, so they are, I don't know how perhaps you can get them more prepared for all these challenges? I open it to all of you.
I think this is a complicated situation because the Refugee Convention says so you can cross the borders without having visa in case when you actually need to seek for safety. And for example, in Australian context, people are penalized for actually adhering, to the human rights international law for crossing the borders without a visa. A lot of countries, sort of keep closing the borders in different ways. And I think, people do sort of know in terms of, the possibility to seek asylum sometimes, but every time migration system is created in a way that the whole burden of proof is on you, and you have to be able to talk about your experiences in a particular legal way, trying to explain everything. And I think without legal representation for people, that's difficult to be able, to talk your story in that way. Quite often also you're technically not allowed to exactly guide people through the process if you're not a lawyer, because you're going to be seen as giving migration advice. I think the thing goes, you know, if we're talking about camps, we have to have the staff trained, and we have to have the responsibility of those international NGOs, the UNHCR, to making sure that they are protecting people, because I don't think that happens consistently. People are still scared to come out. Obviously, you know, in transit experiences, people on the move, they are subjected to violence. And, you know, this is the question of, you know, broader peace, I guess, everywhere. And then here in Australia, we really need a lot of communities to step up as well to support, and in particular LGBTQ+ communities, because I don't think that possibly displaced people have been really much on the radar for the LGBTQ+ communities yet.
Thank you, Tina. Anybody else would like to, from the panel, would like to make suggestions on that question? No? Okay, so Grace, this is one question for you there in the question box. What should protection of LGBTIQ displaced person in transition countries look like? What frameworks are needed to make them more visible? What do you think, Grace?
I think that is like the biggest question in the living history of the world, and I might need some help from all the panelists. But essentially, we need to actually implement basic human rights protections. So we're not, so we need to actually ensure that we look at the Yogyakarta principles, that we take the work that's been done by UNHCR, that we look at the range of issues facing people, and that we ensure that people are included. And I know that that is like a huge generalization, but there has work been done in this space, and it is possible to actually take some of that work and start to implement it. I think actually the core thing that we need to do is a combination of, at the same time as doing no harm, actually collecting data so that that data can be used to actually develop services which meet specific needs. So that's the first thing I think that we really need to start to be doing. And then as in the same time as doing that, we need to look at how people's specific needs might be met. And that does actually mean looking at, what do we mean by a family? How are we understanding gender or the needs of genders? What does safety, and what are we talking about when we mean safety and protection in specific realms? Are we actually consulting with, listening to, involving people with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, gender expressions in the conversations about what they need, about what they identify as needing, about what they see the risks are? If you're talking, I mean, I don't know, Tina, Prince, Bijan, you might have much better thoughts than that.
Safe houses. I think
Yes.
accommodation is such an issue. Safe houses, when you're training for those services, working with people, so people know when they come to the service, whatever that is, that they're going to be safe and not discriminated.
Yep.
And that also means that there has to be visibility that the service is inclusive in all possible ways, posters and stuff. And I think it's co-designed, because we'll look, for example, at Asia at the moment. There's so many refugee-led and LGBTQ+ refugee-led groups in Asia. And so those links exist, because when somebody tells me, you know, we don't know anybody, that only reflects that you not created conditions for people to actually tell you, because there are people, and sexual gender diversity has existed in every documented culture in the world. Where there was still persecuted, that's a different story, but it existed everywhere. And we have to make sure that we're supporting those organizations, because, you know, the communities have the solutions, and we just have to make sure that they have safety to be able to implement those solutions.
Thank you so much, everybody. I'm sorry, time is up. So I'm going to pass on to Linda from CBNI to close this event. With all, thank you. Please, a big round of applause for all of the panelists. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bram. Yes, I'll keep this quick. Thank you so much to all of our wonderful guest speakers tonight, Jaya Dantas, Tina Dixon, Bijan Karduni, Prince, and Grace Jones. So the knowledge, experiences and stories that you shared were enlightening, moving, and gave us a lot of food for thought and for action as well. Finally, thank you to Ariel and the Cultural Diversity Network team who helped organize this webinar. Cultural Diversity Network, Inc. is a community organisation committed to helping migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers achieve a sense of belonging, independence, and purpose through education, work, and social connection. We do have our third webinar on post-settlement experiences of LGBTQIA plus refugees and asylum seekers coming up in early 2021. Please keep a lookout for the date on our website, cdni.org.au. We also have 2 upcoming events supporting the mental health of refugees and asylum seekers on the 21st and 28th of November at Cabramatta Community Centre in Sydney, made possible through the support of Fairfield City Council. So please register through our website there. So we would love to see you there. Thank you all for participating tonight and have a good evening. See you next time.
Thank you all. Thanks, Linda.